that really interests me about you is that you have experience and knowledge and, s- some work that's really fascinating in cryptids. Now, personally, I grew up and I was very fascinated by ghosts and
Mhm.
and hauntings, and I always thought that when we spoke about paranormal, that's basically all that was included, just ghosts and hauntings, haunted places. But I came to realize that also includes like Bigfoot and fairies, and I didn't know what cryptids were really, but it's like those type of creatures, chupacabra, and like all those folklore creatures. Uh, and I never really got into that. Because to me it was always like folklore. It was like urban legends. But I think there's much more to it than what people would really realize. So, explain to me like how you got started first of all in that.
Yeah, well, let me write down the first part of that question too,
Mhm,
because I want to make sure I come back to it.
mhm,
But I was always sort of into weird stuff for the longest time. I think my first love was probably Bigfoot and stuff like that.
mhm,
I grew up in a household that really wasn't discouraging of an interest in this sort of stuff. So I had a couple of Bigfoot books on my shelf and that sort of thing. Um, to make a long story short, I ended up getting a desk job out of grad school, started listening to paranormal podcasts again, and started noticing some things that people really kind of weren't talking about, and followed up on it and ended up writing my first book. So I guess this was sort of always with me in some ways. If I really
mhm,
had to sort of pinpoint my deepest interest in all this stuff, it's probably the fact that I was a monster kid. I was into. I mean,
mhm.
well, first of all, I was a dinosaur kid, right? You're either a dinosaur kid or like a construction vehicle kid.
Right.
As a boy. Yeah, and so I was a dinosaur boy, and then I was a monster boy. So that's always sort of been in my background. And yeah, I mean, you do have these sort of like little micro evolutions
Mhm,
across your trajectory as you're into this stuff, like you were alluding to, like your sort of your attitudes and your opinions evolve and change. And yeah, that was definitely one that I sort of came around to later in life, because I was always interested in. Yeah, I was kind of interested in ghosts, although to me it was the the least hard to believe, right? It was just like, of course ghosts exist is kind of my
mhm,
attitude. But I was definitely very much in the camp that stuff like Bigfoot and other cryptids were, if they existed at all, flesh and blood creatures. And I
mhm,
was in that camp until, relatively recently, probably. I was still kind of in that space as of like 2018 or 2017,
mhm,
even though I was starting to see similarities. And that's really what sort of pushed me over the edge, was that you start to see so many similarities between these other areas of the paranormal, and they end up sort of bleeding over into each other and cross-pollinating. So I have come around to the personal conclusion, and there are plenty of people who would intensely fight back against this, and I respect their arguments. But I've come to the personal conclusion that a lot of these cryptids are something that can be physical but can also be non-physical, and they probably do have more in common with ghosts than they do with giant monkeys running around the woods in the case of
yeah.
Bigfoot.
So I actually do
But
have one
mhm,
quick question.
yeah,
Sorry to interrupt you, but could zombies kind of be considered cryptids though?
well, I mean, so by conventional definitions, cryptids. I'm even kind of playing fast and loose with the cryptid definition here. So a traditional cryptozoologist would tell you that they are purely searching for flesh and blood creatures that science hasn't discovered, right? Hidden animals, right? That's where the name comes from.
Mhm,
Um, Now, of course, since I'm sort of talking about the paranormal aspects of cryptids, I'm sort of straying myself from that conventional definition. I would say that something like zombies, should they exist, would probably be more of a parapsychological phenomenon. Although I I'm sort of lumping cryptids into the parapsychology again.
mhm,
So the way that I tend to use cryptids now is something that at the very least presents itself as possibly being a real animal, regardless of whether
Mm.
it is or not. There's a cryptozoologist, or Fortean, I guess is a better way to put it, out of the UK by the name of Jonathan Downes, who started using the phrase zooform entities to describe things like these sort of cryptids that have more supernatural qualities. So I would think that even though at the end of the day these things might all sort of be coming from a similar place, zombies would not necessarily be in the cryptid category. And of
Mhm.
course, it depends on what kind of zombies we're talking about, right? Are we talking about the traditional Haitian zombie tradition, or are we talking about, like, the sort of Hollywood version?
The cemetery.
Yeah, right, yeah, right. Revenants, that sort of thing, which I would definitely put in sort of a more supernatural category. But I suppose what I would sort of say to sort of
Mhm.
pick up on one last thing that you had in your original sort of statement or question is, yeah, I mean, urban legends, a lot of these things have a lot of those qualities. The thing about urban legends that is really sort of challenging for me is that, like, a lot of these are demonstrably untrue, right?
Mhm.
Lots of times you'll have a haunting that's attributed to a bride who, jumped off of the building and is seen in white at the building, years later. And you go
Mhm.
back through the historical record and there's no record of that particular tragedy taking place, right? But people will still see, that sort of apparition. So I think that what we're really kind of dealing with in a lot of these spaces, again, this is just my own personal conclusions, is that we're seeing some sort of genuine phenomenon mixed up with how we believe and expect these things to appear, right? And I don't know if that means it comes from us or that we're interacting with some sort of intelligence that sort of, looks through our brain and figures out uh, what we expect to see, or what. But I think that it's a less cut and dry phenomenon that's going on
Mhm.
with a lot of these things.
Yeah, because it's very fascinating in that a lot of it has to do also with urban legends. So I guess I wanted to ask you, are there any cryptids that, first of all, are you like a skeptic when it comes to cryptids, or are you kind of like on the fence?
I'm I like I'm a contrarian, really, is what it is at the end of the day. Like,
Mhm.
I'm 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 too much of I'm too much of a believer for the skeptics, and sometimes too much of a skeptic for the believers. Um, because, again, my attitudes for a lot of these things are sort of unorthodox. I mean, as far as the idea of, and I keep on going to Bigfoot because it's sort of
Mhm.
like, the cryptid celebrity. So for the sake of
Mhm.
argument, we'll stay in Bigfoot land, although you could extrapolate what I'm about to say to other cryptids.
Mhm.
Um, I feel that in many of the places where something like Bigfoot is seen, the resources provided by the environment are not sufficient to sustain an animal that large, right? I mean,
Mhm.
that and the fact that, you have some of these Bigfoot sightings where it's 7 or even 8 feet tall, right? Like, we're talking about large animals, sometimes living in close proximity to human settlements. And look, I totally understand that we have a lot of undeveloped land in this country, a lot more than places like the UK for sure. But at the same time, I've also collected stories of Bigfoot in, parks in the Chicago area, right? Um, I've collected stories of um Bigfoot that seem to be inhabiting small areas, like right near towns, and seem to literally walk behind trees and disappear. So I'm not, when I say that, people will hear me say that and say, "Oh, you're a skeptic. You don't believe that Bigfoot exists." It's like, no, I totally believe that there is a Bigfoot phenomenon.
Mhm.
I just don't necessarily think that I see enough of the skeptical arguments, right? Because we should have a body. Like, we should have a
Mhm.
body. And again, I can have a conversation with the people who prefer the flesh and blood idea. I can have that conversation about, like, well, we don't find bear carcasses that often. I get it. We don't find cougar carcasses that often. I get it. But we have found them, right? We do have specimens. I feel like something as large as Bigfoot, we should have a body by now. And yet, I speak with tons of people who are adamant about what they've seen, especially, hunters who are, spend a ton of time in the woods, who have, interacted with bears and stuff all the time and say, what I saw was not a bear, this was different. I believe them, but I also see the position that skeptics are coming from. So that's sort of the tension that I'm always caught in between. And
Mhm.
that's a big thing. That's a big part of what led me to the conclusion that whatever we're interacting with in the Bigfoot phenomenon, and again, you can extrapolate this to a lot of other cryptids, I think, is something that's almost paraphysical or somehow caught between what we would think of as the physical and the non-physical. Now, again, I get a lot of pushback from traditional cryptozoologists because they'll say things like, well, you're saying it's a ghost. Ghosts don't leave footprints, right? But then
Mhm.
I always have to say, wait a minute. Like, if you look into your early, like, if you look into your like 19th century ghost hunting manuals, like that's a way that you would ghost hunt back then, is you would put talcum powder on the floor and wait for ghost footprints to appear. Ghosts in hauntings slam doors all the time. They knock things off shelves. So I think what we're really struggling with, as a culture, but as people involved in the paranormal specifically, is we're really struggling with this false dichotomy between physical and non-physical, which I think is the same as, like, a material or psychic tension, or an internal or external tension, as you might see with people who have psychedelic experiences or religious revelations, or, dare it be said, we were talking about urban legends a moment ago,
Mhm.
fiction and nonfiction. Like, I think that's still that tension of, like, well, something's internal, something's psychic, something's mental, and yet there's a physical component too. That's that fiction, nonfiction, fiction fact tension as well. And that's, I think, part of how you get urban legends that people still see, even though there's no historical basis for it.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's very interesting because it's like hard to find the absolute truth, and that's kind of what you're alluding to. That if you don't believe one truth, then people accuse you of being a skeptic just because there's just one truth that is, I guess,
Right.
non-conventional, right?
No, it's people like to put you in a they like to put a label on you, and
Mhm,
put you in this one side. They like to sort it out, and we like to make our own tribes and stuff. And I really
mhm,
don't think it's that simple. And that's why, my journey through all these different topics, because I am interested in everything. I'm interested in the ghost stuff. I'm interested in, as you alluded to, the fairy folklore. I'm
mhm,
interested in the cryptid stuff. I'm interested in the UFO stuff. I'm interested in all these topics. But I think that my own personal journey through it has led me into things that are more about, like, questioning the nature of reality, and
mhm.
questioning, the limits of human perception, what it means for something to be a subjective truth versus an objective truth, right? These are
Right.
the sort of conversations that I think, when you approach a lot of these topics in the right spirit, like, you sort of get led down these pathways, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and it's kind of funny because there was also a conversation that I had with someone else, but this goes back to hauntings, and so there was a story of a haunting that took place, or this facility that is haunted because of a murder that took place in that facility in the 90s, let's say. And I tried to go back and look through records of any murders that happened in this facility that caused this place to be haunted, but there was no records uh, of such a murder taking place, or of of that specific employee ever working there. So it goes back to, okay, now you create stories that are not really based on any truth, and that kind of is what develops into people becoming skeptics, because now there's just urban legends, or just stories that get passed down, but there's no truth behind those stories, if that makes any sense,
Right.
right?
No, that absolutely makes sense, and that happens, like, so much of the time. I mean, another good way to think of this is, like, I'm still fascinated by the fact that we haven't really explained what the placebo effect is. They
Mhm.
do these sort of double-blind medical trials, and they give one group of people the actual medicine and one group of people, a sugar pill or whatever. And people will have actual, physical changes in their symptoms from taking the sugar pill because they think it's the real medicine, right? And I think that speaks to so much about how what we expect can influence our experience, right? And so, regardless of whether or not, there's a paper trail for someone being murdered in a specific area, um, if what happens when you go into that space expecting something strange to happen? Or, if you want to sort of extrapolate this to, a more metaphysical idea, what happens when hundreds of thousands of people all believe that yes, this murder took place there and
Mhm.
that place is haunted? Like, do you step into a space where that has sort of become some kind of truth, even though
Mhm.
it's not rooted in the historical record? There's enough belief surrounding it that people will actually experience something that is genuinely strange.
Could it be possible that certain apparitions happen to certain people and not others?
Oh, absolutely. So one of my favorite things to talk about. Sorry, I have a lot of favorite stuff to talk about. One of my favorite things to highlight, right, in this
Yeah.
space, and sort of getting to the heart of what I find interesting about it, is that it's kind of a dirty little secret that eyewitnesses don't always agree in their
Mhm.
sightings. What do I mean by that specifically? I've run into cases where people will both agree that they saw a Bigfoot, but in broad daylight. But one person will say it was light colored, and the other one will say it was dark colored. I've run into cases where you'll have like a group of five people, and three of them will say, yeah, it was shaped like a cigar, and it had red and blue lights along the sides. The other people will say, no, it was shaped like a cigar, but the lights were green and white. So
Mhm.
there'll be this tension, this disagreement. A good case of this, a good example of this is from Wollaton Park in the UK, Nottinghamshire. There was a paranormal researcher. Wollaton Park's got its own sort of weird history, but there was a paranormal researcher who, as a child, ran into something with a friend, and I can't remember his particular name, but the basics of the story were,
Mhm.
as a boy, he and a friend were in Wollaton Park, and they both ran away from something that terrified them. And then when they got away from it and compared notes, he basically saw a Bigfoot. He saw like a wild man, right? But his friend saw like a smoky circular shape, like a smoky donut shape that was floating
Mhm.
out of the darkness towards them. So, like, what is happening there, right? Um, where you have people who both agree that something terrifying, something unusual is being seen, but they completely disagree on what was seen. What does that mean? And I think that what it suggests to me, at least, is that the way that these things appear to us is something more of a direct interface, right? It's not necessarily as
Mhm.
objective as we would think it is. It's something that's more subjective. And as I heard from Dr. Julia Mossbridge at a recent panel that we were on together, it's kind of easy to think about this in terms of what is an objective truth, right? An objective
Mhm.
truth is two or more subjective views agreeing on something, right?
Mhm.
So at the end of the day, when you drill down deep enough, everything is a subjective viewpoint. It's just that the things that where we find two separate subjective viewpoints agreeing, that becomes an objective truth, and then gets sort of folded into consensus reality. And you find that the beliefs or the statements of the people around us can often sometimes color, what we think we see. Like, so they've done studies with people in a room, and there'll be some plants in there, and the people, not like plants like in a pot, but like people who were planted as part of this group, as part of the study. And
Yeah.
like they'll say, which of these lights is brighter, or which of these pencils is shorter, and there'll be an obvious answer, but like the people who were in there, planted in there, will deliberately give the wrong answer, and they'll find that a certain number of people will say the wrong answer as well, because they don't want to be kept out of the out group. So
Mhm.
I think consensus reality is a stranger thing than we give it credit for.
Yeah, so one of my favorite I guess stories that I've heard, I guess something similar to like Bigfoot, is people seeing aliens as these 10 feet creatures. Have you heard of those stories?
I mean, yeah, so the ones that come to mind most recently, it seems a bit more, well, let me backtrack. Um, I'm aware of stories like this, especially from, around the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall in Russia. There was a whole
Mhm.
sort of glasnost wave, is what Fillet called it. Um, More recently, though, I've been hearing these stories, come out, and without, insinuations that that was what was happening in the Miami Mall incident, or
Mhm.
the backyard in Las Vegas that happened. What was that, last year or 2 years ago? These taller beings as well. Yeah, I have heard some of that.
Yeah, so I live in Vegas actually. So I
Oh,
mean,
okay.
yeah, so like stories like that fascinate me because it's just so close to home that
Yeah.
it because I've always thought of aliens as being little creatures, but now there are people describing them as like 10 feet creatures. And there's several stories like that. People call in like 911 and describe like there's this 10-foot figure like in my
Yeah.
backyard, for example, that happened here.
Well, I mean, so this is actually another good sort of example of exactly what we're talking about, right?
Mhm.
If you look back through the history of ufology, and you make it a point to like read reports from all over the place, you'll soon find that a lot of the descriptions of UFO occupants were not only like time dependent, they weren't only dependent on a certain era, right? But they were also dependent upon a certain place. So if you look at the 50s through the 60s in the US, you would get a lot of, well, straight up monsters, right? Like one-off monsters that never appeared again, right? But you also got Space Brothers and Space Sisters, which
Mhm.
are like, maybe we'd call them the Tall Whites or something today, but like Nordic
Mhm.
kind of aliens, right? But then you go into South America and you get a lot of reports of small hairy dwarves, around the same time
Mhm.
period. Um, and then you go over into, as I alluded to earlier, like, Russia and the Eastern Bloc, and you get sort of like robot creatures and things like that,
Mhm.
and then of course, you go to like indigenous populations in Africa, and you're hearing stories about ancestors coming down from the stars that look like, the people who are they're visiting with, right? So it's
Mhm.
it's always sort of like time and place dependent, and it seems to change over the years because there is that sort of inflection point in that like 1977 through 86 era. People always point to Communion, the cover of Communion, as being like the
Mhm.
flashpoint for gray aliens, but there are gray aliens, in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which is 77. But from that point, this sort of takes over, and the same thing can be said for the craft themselves, right?
Mhm.
The early 20th century, you read all these reports of what we would call UFOs today, and they're like these steampunk airships, right? Like like dirigibles and like this
Yeah.
goofy, piloted by these insane inventors from other planets and stuff. And then in the 50s, 47, Kenneth Arnold says that he sees these objects skipping like flying saucers over Mount Rainier. He wasn't referring to their shape though. He was talking about the way that they moved, right?
Mhm.
The actual things that Kenneth Arnold saw were like shaped like bat wings or chevrons. But the term flying saucer gets sort of like embedded in the culture, and then what do people start seeing? They start seeing like actual discs, like flying
Mhm.
saucers going around. And then you got the black triangles of the 70s and 80s, as the sort of stealth bomber program ramps up. And nowadays, like, we have conflated mystery drones with UFOs. That's the new shape that the UFO has taken. And the skeptics will hear this and they'll say, "Oh, well, that just means that this is all suggestion and
Mhm.
cultural programming." And I think the opposite. I think that we're interacting with something that is in a dialogue with us, right? We're interacting with something that is listening to our expectations,
Yeah.
and it's listening and it's reacting and it's changing according to what we expect to see, right? And those,
Mhm.
I think that the whole current sort of conflation between UFOs and drones right now is an outgrowth of that Tic Tac video, right? Because it was sort of this drone-like object, and it's like by far. I mean, honestly, I'm trying to think of what other UFO pictures might have that sort of like cultural impact as the Tic Tac
Mhm.
video. It might be Gulf Breeze, it might be the Adamski stuff, both of which were, dubious to say the best. McMinnville maybe, but the point that I'm making is that like something is listening. you know,
Yeah.
people still have burn marks on their property, right? And
Mhm.
like at landing sites, their cars still get shut down. People still have scoop marks on their hands. Um, if it's just people making up stories to conform to cultural trends, that doesn't do that. But something that is listening and adapting to our cultural expectations might be, right?
Right. Yeah. And something that I wonder also is if it's just some government programs and they're trying to pass these off as being
Always,
just, yeah.
always, my friend, always. Like, that's the thing that kind of kills me, to be honest with you, is that
Hmm.
like ufologists are so concerned with exopolitics
Hmm.
that they forget that geopolitics exist, right? Like, they're so concerned about other planets and interacting with them that they're like, no, there's still like a whole audience for these shenanigans here on Earth. And a classic example of this is, when the Navy started taking UFO reports again. I guess this probably was 2017-ish, 2018-ish, in the wake of the New York Times article. The
Hmm.
Navy started like, taking reports of UFOs again, and I'm like, this is crowdsourcing, right? This is crowdsourcing to get people's eyes on the sky so that we know what's, what sort of foreign incursions we might have and stuff like this. Like, there's always, since the very beginning of the UFO question, been this presence of the authorities, in terms of using the community to seed disinformation and to sort of collect information, right? But
Hmm.
that doesn't mean that there's not a real phenomenon going on at the same time, right? It's just that um, the powers that be like to hijack that narrative too,
Hmm.
right? So the answer is always going to be like 60-40, right? Or at least. And that is to the point that I would also like to make, is that, I think that with all these topics that we've been talking about, ghosts
Yeah.
and cryptids and UFOs, it's I don't know if it's ever one answer for all of them, right? Like take the UFO
Hmm.
question in particular. A significant portion is going to be misidentification, just is.
Hmm.
A portion might be misunderstood atmospheric phenomena or stuff that we haven't cataloged yet. Maybe a portion of it is forms of life in our atmosphere that we don't recognize. Maybe a portion of it is actual aliens. Maybe a portion of it is mass formation poltergeist events. And a portion of it's going to be, just, military shenanigans and unorthodox terrestrial craft. Like, I think it's always going to be a mixture, whatever the answer is, right?
Right. And I kind of want to go back to what you said that, everybody's just like looking up. I wonder if that's could be used as a metaphor that the government has us looking up instead of like looking at what is around us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really, I think it's a really deep thing that you sort of
Mhm.
articulated there because we're looking up. I mean, so I have sort of I kind of hate outer space. And the reason that I hate outer space,
Yeah.
so this will make sense here in a second. The reason that I hate outer space is I think that people don't grasp quite how difficult it would be to get a foothold somewhere off planet, right? Like
Mhm.
even Mars, that's a lot of work that's still going to happen to get us to colonize Mars or something like that. I mean, heck, even colonizing the moon's going to take some effort. So this idea that like we're gonna like burn through planet Earth and hop on our lifeboats and leave, like that is so difficult to conceive of. I think it might as well be a fantasy, right? So
Mhm.
speaking, in terms of what you said there, we're looking up so that we're not looking down and around us and appreciating that this is all we've got and
Mhm.
appreciating that we have to make peace with the people that are around us and we're all in this together. Like,
Mhm.
I think that there's some real wisdom in that statement.
Mhm.
To say nothing of the fact that the way that fears of this sort of threat narrative that we're constantly being fed about UFOs, how those fears could be weaponized too, heading into, quite frankly, what looks every day more and more like World War III.
Right. But yeah, and I mean another thing that crosses my mind is that space is just so big that you're telling me that
So big.
we're the only I guess living creatures in this entire universe. Like that doesn't seem real.
No, I mean, so this is where sort of people I think sort of get what I'm not saying that you are, but people
Mhm.
get my position. They get it kind of backwards because they'll hear me say, "Well, I don't think that the UFO phenomenon is extraterrestrial," and they'll think that
Mhm.
means that I think that there are no extraterrestrials out there, and like there
Mhm.
there have to be, like there have to be extraterrestrials out there, right? Um, I think that it's just so much space, and it's there's just I can't help but imagine that's not the case, that there's some form of intelligent life out there. I just am not sure that unless let's put the right way to put this,
Hmm.
for those races to visit Earth from the nearest known planets. I mean, you're talking about a lot of those civilizations leaving like 2,000 years ago, right? They're not
Hmm.
coming and going. Um, but for them to visit Earth in any sort of frequent transitory capacity going back and forth, their understanding of physics would have to be so weird that I think it would upend materialism as a
Hmm.
paradigm, right? Like, I think we're dealing with something that's just so far beyond our comprehension, and
Hmm.
we're dealing with stuff where we're dealing in a worldview, a view of reality, where things like telepathy and precognition are
Hmm.
very commonplace. Right?
Hmm.
If these aliens are able to bend physics that much, then I think that's kind of the space that we wind up in which case, who's to say they have to be aliens at all? They could be, they could be space ghosts. I don't know. They could be a lot of different things. There are a lot of different forms of life,
Or
a
I
lot of different
mean,
possibilities. Yeah,
also us from the future could be.
that's a great. Yeah, I mean, that's so. Every now and then, I'm glad you mentioned that because every now and then there are these ideas that come up that I don't want to be true, but are really compelling.
Hmm.
And that's one of them. The idea that like maybe we're just time traveling and visiting ourselves backwards. I think that's a really good hypothesis. It's a good it should remain on the table. There's a lot of compelling evidence for that. And I I mean, by the nature of what it would represent, if a time machine is ever going to be invented, we would be interacting with it by now. Or you know what I mean? Because like
Hmm.
it can go anywhere in time. And if you read these stories, even some select cryptid stories, select ghost stories, but especially the UFO thing, like time is involved somehow. They're
Hmm.
always the testimony of these occupants is always that they're sort of positioned outside time and people have missing time, and there are even examples of gained time, which is kind of
Hmm.
a mind-blowing proposition. So yeah, I think that that needs to stay on the table too, right?
Yeah, like one of my favorite theories is that these creatures are like interdimensional creatures and they travel through dimensions. I think that's a pretty interesting theory.
Yeah, I mean I think it's an interesting theory. It's definitely one that I'm more sympathetic with
Hmm.
than the extraterrestrial hypothesis. My thing that I always sort of run up against when I talk about that is I start talking about, other dimensions and things along those lines, and I start to find myself sounding like, a medieval demon hunter, or witch hunter,
Yeah.
and I don't know how far removed that possibility of like, oh, other dimensions, is that really anything different than us talking about, fairyland or the other world or the astral plane or any of these things? Like, I think that's
Mhm.
kind of where we're talking about the same thing. So, um, but yeah, I think that's another good possibility too. The idea that like, and to talk about something that's terrifying, the idea that they're, in the room with you right now, in the room with me right now, and we just don't realize it, because we're
Mhm.
just slightly out of phase. That's terrifying.
Yeah, and also wanted to touch on fairies. So fairies is actually something that I don't really know much about. So give me like a 101, like on what fairies are. Are they just these magical creatures that grant you wishes, or what are they?
Yeah, so this is kind of when I first talk to people about this, like there's always a lot of resistance to this because fairies
Mhm.
are kind of the punchline, right? Like when people
Mhm.
are talking about, oh, I believe in UFOs and I believe in Bigfoot, but it's not like I believe in leprechauns. It's always the punchline. It's like
Mhm.
people always sort of think that that's a bridge too far. And what I think really should be emphasized is that like these are all just labels, right?
Mhm.
Um, so I don't think that describing what we're interacting with as fairies or aliens is accurate. I don't think either of those terms is accurate. I don't really
Mhm.
know what to call them, but I have a sense that we used to call them by a variety of different names, right? So
Mhm.
that's the central argument of Dr. Jacques Vallée in his work Passport to Magonia is that there are a lot of similarities between fairies and what we interact with in the modern UFO experience. So as to what the fairies are or were, no one knows. There are fairy
Mhm.
scholars out there, and there's the debate continues about whether they were elemental nature spirits or they were, demoted pagan deities. Like, Christianity comes along and says, your gods are no longer gods. They were fairies. They sort of demote them that way.
Mm.
Um, if they were another version you might hear of what the fairies are is angels too bad for heaven or demons too good for hell that got trapped here on Earth.
Mhm.
Or honestly, the human dead. There are a lot of stories from fairy believing cultures where people will see the human dead, neighbors and friends and relatives, with the fairies. But specifically, what we can sort of call fairies, we're mostly looking at a tradition from Western Europe, although I think a very strong case can be made that every culture has its own version of fairies. Even
Mhm.
here in the United States, indigenous people believed in little people and all sorts of things that we would call fairies, even if that wasn't the name that they would use.
And tooth fairies.
Um, well, the tooth fairy is I mean, it's definitely part of that continuum of continued fairy belief. But the fairies have really been done a disservice with things like the tooth fairy over the
Mhm.
past several hundred years. What we know of as fairies now, when we think of fairies, we think of like, little winged women with like, tutus and they're flying around granting wishes and stuff. And that's just not what they were. That's just not
Mhm.
what they were. If you look at that back at like any sort of indigenous or, the older fairy stories from Western Europe, they oftentimes were the same size as your average human being, although they could tend to be small. They were mischievous. They never had wings, ever. Um, they had
Mm.
powers of levitation, but they were not granted wings. The wings are sort of a children's book and theatrical add-on around the Victorian era, I believe. And they could do miraculous things for you, like granting wishes, but like they were also like really temperamental. So there was this sort of unwritten book of rules that if you violated one of the rules, they might like just blind you because that's just you didn't follow the rules, that sort of thing. Where plenty of stories of people who are cutting down a tree that was sacred to the fairies, and they end up, not being able to use one of their legs for the rest of their life because the fairies
Mm.
got upset. Um, Subterranean dwelling, generally but not always small, loved kidnapping people, especially women and children, liked to substitute their own, like to steal children and substitute something of their own, like one of their own offspring. These are all things that we might say about the fairies, and there are these traditions again. We talk a lot about Europe, but you can find it everywhere.
Mhm.
And what soon becomes apparent if you start looking at some of the things that were reported in these stories, they're so specific to what seems to be happening in the UFO literature. I mean, a good example of this is, well, on the face
Mhm.
of it, little men in green turned into little green men, right? You read these stories about like, oh, the fairies being these smaller beings, but they're overseen by a taller member of fairy royalty, like a fairy king or a fairy queen, which
Mhm.
sounds very much like, you've got the worker drones and you've got the taller supervising gray alien that's, the tall version, like you were talking about earlier. Um, you have the ability to disappear at will, um, the ability to make people and things disappear. Uh,
Mhm.
the sort of subterranean element that I mentioned, there's, supposedly there are alien bases underground in certain places. Um, there's a whole list. The moment where I said, okay, this is way too specific to be coincidental, is when I was looking at, the phenomenon of alien implants, right? So this idea that you get abducted by an alien and something gets slipped under your skin to track you. You've heard this,
Mhm.
I'm sure. And I'm like, that's such like a 20th century idea of tagging animals and releasing them. Like there's not going to be anything like
Mhm.
that in fairy lore, and sure enough, there is actually. So in the modern alien implant stories, like people will find something. An experiencer will find something underneath their skin. They'll sort of, poke at it. They might have it removed, and whenever it was removed, it would be like, it's almost always, it doesn't look like technology, right? It looks like a bit
Mhm.
of ceramic that got wedged under their skin, or some glass, or a rock, or something, or some calcified material. Like it always sort of looks like just, debris, right?
Mhm.
Well, in the older fairy traditions, especially in Newfoundland, but also, uh, an outgrowth of Ireland, if you offended the fairies, they could do something similar to you.
Hmm.
So the words blast, blister, and blustery all have the same Germanic root. Because if you um, offended the fairies on a blustery day, they might send a
Hmm.
blast of wind your way and leave you with a blister. And in that blister, it was called the fairy blast. And in that blister, it would it could, make you disabled. It could, make you not be able to use an appendage for a while. And sometimes they would open up the wound in these older stories. And what
Hmm.
came out, the same sort of stuff that we see in the alien implants today, right? It would be like a bit of bone or a bit of rock or just some debris, a piece of a tooth or something like this. So it's such a close match for what we see in the alien implant
Yeah.
story that it was like, well, there's a lot of similarities here, a lot of similarities here. So my position is that um, I'm not saying that our ancestors. I do mean that collectively, like humanity's ancestors. Our
Hmm.
ancestors weren't seeing aliens and calling them fairies.
Hmm.
And you and me today aren't seeing fairies and calling them aliens. I think that these are labels that just don't apply to whatever this thing is.
Hmm.
I think that this thing is real, and I think that it has an autonomy or a perceived autonomy outside of us. Uh, but I don't think that either of those labels is real. I just think that's something old that's been with us for as long as we can remember.
Yeah, and going back to how stories get passed down, and if you don't believe a story, they come out and call you a skeptic. But I mean, what I'm really trying to get at is that let's use chupacabras as an
Hmm.
example, right? I think I came across that they were just coyotes or some type of animal that were killing sheep, and they
Hmm.
didn't really quite know what was well, what were the animals behind that. And even with fairies, maybe like back in the day when people didn't really quite know the world around them, they could have looked simply at a dragonfly or a firefly, those that light up, right? And could
Hmm.
have called that a fairy. And I think stories like that get passed down and they become certain like folklore. I mean, wouldn't you
Hmm.
agree that that could be the case at times?
Yeah, I do think that there's some of that going on. I mean, with the fairy stuff especially, it gets difficult because a lot of people in the Middle Ages and onward would sort of use the term fairy like we would use the term supernatural, right? So
Um,
like, uh, you know, uh, something fell off my wall today.
mhm.
Something made the picture fly off my wall today. Oh, that's fairy. It doesn't necessarily mean that there were fairies. It just means that sort of it applied to that sort of like
The
unknown
unknown.
quantity, right? Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And look, so what you're sort of discussing here is a bit of a euhemerist perspective, right? And
Mhm.
that means this idea that people had a living experience with something that sort of evolved into folklore over time. And I think that there is some of that that goes on from time to time. The thing that I would always sort of emphasize and re-emphasize is that if you talk to certain scholars of folklore, they they divide certain things into fairy tales, legends, and myths, right?
Mhm.
And fairy tales are, patently fictions, right? Like they're kind of like frivolities. They don't really have that as much substance.
Yeah.
There might be a lesson in there, but it's not like a deep human sort of lesson. Legends are things that sort of reside in this state of indeterminacy, right? Like King Arthur. Was King Arthur real or was King Arthur not real? Like it's kind of like ambiguous, right? So that's more of a legend. And then a myth.
Mhm.
Well, a myth is something that may not have literally happened, but it's like it's one of the deepest, truest things that you can say about the way that the world works, right? About
Right.
the way that human beings work, right? So that's when sort of this that when you go back to something that's that far into the past, I can acknowledge the fact that it might not be true as literally presented, but there's still sometimes a truth that's embedded in it, right?
Mhm.
So I think that you're absolutely right that there's always been that sort of interplay. I mean, you can look at Starlight is a good example in the North Carolina mountains and elsewhere. It's this cross-shaped mineral that forms, and nowadays we know exactly why starlight forms from a geologic perspective, right? It's no mystery. There are certain, I believe, hexagonal sort of structures in the rocks, whatever. That's
Mhm.
neither here nor there. At one time, they were conceptualized as, sprouting up wherever the fairies wept. So, like, there is sort of this interplay and this sort of back and forth dialogue between our scientific understanding and our assumptions. And what really I think is worth paying attention to are those things that withstand the test of time and still have those deeper truths embedded in them, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, so everything about cryptids and the paranormal and goes, it's very interesting because there's a lot of overlapping that goes between all those different stories, uh, and that's why I go back to that because what I believe with goes is kind of like the same thing with you. Not necessarily that I don't really know whether to consider myself a believer or a non-believer because some ghost stories make sense, but then some other ghost stories, you go back to, I don't think that's really true. Like, I don't
Yeah,
think those
yeah.
stories are really true. But
Well, you
it's,
don't have, but here's the thing that
mhm,
like I love hearing you say that because you don't have to like
mhm,
you don't have to collapse that waveform, to use a quantum metaphor. Like you can just sort of sit with that, being like, I don't know how I feel about this.
mhm,
I think that a lot of us involved in these topics, like um that's a very honest place to be. Like interest, I call it my interesting if true basket, right? Like I've got
mhm,
a big basket in my head that says interesting if true, and the true basket is really small, and the false basket is really small, but that interesting if true basket is huge. That's where I tend to file stuff away. So to hear you say that, like I think it's a healthy place to be.
mhm. Yeah, because as I said, I grew up watching like paranormal shows, shows about ghosts, uh, and I've always found that very fascinating. With even the Goosebumps, those books, because it's really interesting, and there's a lot of interesting stories behind that, and you don't necessarily have to believe them to be true, but it gives you a perspective into different cultures, especially when it comes to
Right.
cryptids, because cryptids are a reflection of the cultures that brought them about.
100%. Yes. Thank you for saying that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. And the thing that gets really strange, because I just had a conversation with somebody about this the other night. It's like the thing that really irritates me is that you get these skeptics who will hear someone making fantastic claims, let's say about an alien abduction, right?
Mhm.
And they'll make fun of them. And I'm just sitting there and I'm like, okay, look, I can't say whether or not uh, this happened to this person, right?
Right.
But I do know a couple things. I know number one that this is like the last demographic that it's safe to like actively make fun of. By which I mean there are plenty of people making fun of other demographics and being cruel to other races and religions and stuff. But like there's not a cultural advocacy group for experiencers to defend them, right?
Mhm.
So that's one thing that really irritates me. And the other thing that really irritates me is that like some people are lying, yes they are, but there's a substantial cohort that regardless of what happened, alien abduction or not, regardless of what happened, like they believe it happened, and that level of trauma that they're having is just as real as if it had happened as they think it
Mhm.
did, right? So like when you sort of poking fun at people who've experienced this stuff, either number one, you're not being compassionate, but number two, you're either, I mean, you might be making fun of someone who's lying, right? But you
Mhm.
also might be making fun of somebody with mental health issues. You also might be making fun of someone who is sane, but just has legitimate emotions that they're working through.
Mhm.
And heaven forbid, you might be making fun of someone who experienced exactly what they think they were experiencing, right? So
Yeah.
I think that's really important to sort of show that extra level of compassion for people who have been through this sort of stuff.
Yeah. But I mean, this has been a very interesting conversation, and my lights went out.
I kind of like the mood lighting though. It looks
Yeah.
good. Yeah.
No, yeah, it's pretty cool, especially because of this topic. But I've really
Right.
enjoyed our conversation, and it's really interesting to think about all these stories and how how they reflect on culture and how it reflects on just people's perspectives and how like what they make out of them, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I think that um I think that's really encouraging to see the way that a lot of people are starting to handle these stories too, right? And I
Mhm.
think there's a lot more people who are open to them and sort of engaging with that sort of spirit that you mentioned where I don't know if I believe every one of these, but it's still interesting to talk about. And that's a lot of what I try to do sometimes is building a bridge between
Mhm.
quote unquote believers and skeptics,
Yeah.
because I think at the very end of the day, even if none of this stuff is true as we might like to think it is,
Mhm.
it still teaches us a lot about ourselves, right? And I think that's
Yeah.
an important thing worth pursuing too.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
It really was. I really enjoyed our conversation. All right.
Likewise.